Hello and welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles, the 695th Lord Mayor's Lectures. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor calls the world's coffee house, and how these might help us tackle future global challenges. Today we have an intriguing lecture in store entitled Mastering Misinformation, how stories, statistics and studies exploit our biases and what we can do about it. My name is Richard Harvey. I'm a professor at the University of East Anglia and I'm a former Gresham College professor, and I'll be convening the session today and moderating your questions, which I hope will appear in the question box as our speaker today talks and afterwards. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping from me. We have an agenda for today, which you can see here, which is one of the simpler agendas of modern times. The real job of me today is to introduce our speaker, who is Professor Alex Edmonds, who is a finance professor at the London Business School in his most of his time, but he has a number of other interests. And like me, he's a former Gresham College professor. He has a very long and distinguished CV, and rather than sort of run through it in a rather tiresome way, what I'm going to do is, while he's talking, I'm just going to post the URL of his most excellent website that you can have a look at. He's also got a book out at the moment, so I'll post the URL of his book while he's talking. So do look out for that. Right, that is enough from me. Now over to Alex.
Well, thanks so much, Richard. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So this talk is based on a book that I actually just launched yesterday on the dangers of misinformation and how to deal with it. And so this book and this talk more generally is about data and statistics. Now, data and statistics used to be my life before my son, Casper, was born. So his birth was obviously an amazing event, as I'm sure many of you will experience. But then we brought him home and we had to figure out how to look after him. And so I shared the news with one of my friends who's a father of three, and he wrote back to me and said, now it's over and now it starts. Because we needed to figure out what to feed him. And to us, this seemed to be a pretty easy answer, because my wife and I had taken a National Childbirth Trust parenting course. And this covered many topics, such as how to change nappies, how to deal with first aid, but also there were 2 lectures focused on how to breastfeed. And while most of this focused on actual breastfeeding, there was the big part of it at the start on why you should breastfeed to begin with. Because breastfeeding is tough, and they thought by highlighting the benefits of breastfeeding, then weary-eyed parents would still persist with breastfeeding even if it got difficult. And why should you breastfeed? Why do they have a breastfeeding class, not a feeding class? Because of apparently overwhelming evidence that breastfeeding is good for the child. So none other than the World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding, no water, no formula for the first 6 months. And it wasn't just this statement, there was a footnote to this, so we know it had to be true because there was a footnote. Now, the slide deck for the breastfeeding modules was 114 pages, and it proceeded like this. It had lots of statements backed up by some footnotes. But as a professor of finance, I didn't just take this at face value. I wanted to do some digging myself. So I went to trusty Google, and I looked at the link between breastfeeding and IQ. And the first link that popped up was again from a reliable source. It was BBC. And it says there's a link between breastfeeding and higher IQ. A long-term study with 3,500 babies finds a link between breastfeeding and intelligence. If I scroll down, I saw more studies all giving the same conclusion. If I came back to Google and did this on another day, I got a different study, but with the same result. More breastfed participants had higher IQ scores than non-breastfed participants. So this, to my wife and me, gave an unequivocal message. We should only breastfeed our son for the first 6 months, and then he would have high IQ. In fact, why stop at 6 months? We thought maybe should we breastfeed him for 16 months? Then he'd have the highest IQ of anybody in his nursery. But as Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So we intended to breastfeed our son, but in the first few days, the mother doesn't produce breast milk, she produces colostrum. And this was very small, this was not enough to feed our son, so even after he drained her dry, he still wanted more. And so we faced a big dilemma. Do we turn to the bottle? We had been given unequivocal advice only to use breast milk, and yet our son was crying. Should we give in to his cries? So as a parent, you don't always give in when your child cries. Do we give in to his cries for some short-term peace, but perhaps be at the expense of his long-term development because of this link between breastfeeding and IQ? So what I did is I went back to the studies that I had found on Google, but this time, rather than looking at the Google preview, I clicked on the button and read the actual study. And this confirmed what Google said. It said more breastfed participants had higher IQ scores than non-breastfed participants. Google was correct. But if I read on, then 2 sentences down, I found the following. Because of the small sample size, we could not confirm the significant difference between the breastfed and bottle-fed groups. So basically, the difference in IQ was so small that the researchers could not rule out that this was purely down to luck. And it gets even worse, because at the top of the paragraph, it mentions another study, which was even more comprehensive. It looked at 5,475 children. It found that breastfeeding had no significant effect on intelligence. Now, again, there were some references. And so this referenced slide 18, footnote 18. And so what did footnote 18 say? Well, this came up with a study, and the study was available. So I clicked on the study, and then I started to read the study. It was just 6 pages, so even though I was a busy person, I could still read it. And this is what it said. It took the PIAT score. So what is that? Well, that is like a measure of IQ. And it found that the difference between breastfed and bottle-fed kids was nearly 5 IQ points. That's not a huge amount, but it's still significant. If you can increase your child's IQ by 5 just by having a particular feeding method, that was a lot. And if you broke it down by maths and reading and comprehension, that was all still significant, between 4 to 5. But the astute among you will notice this word here, which is unadjusted. So what does this mean? These are the raw differences between breastfed and bottle-fed kids, not adjusting for other differences between them. And what might those other differences be? Well, notice that breastfed and bottle-fed kids might differ according to lots of other dimensions. Breastfeeding is tough. It can be exhausting without family support. So maybe the kids who were breastfed had a happier and more comfortable home environment to begin with. Maybe they had 2 parents, maybe there was help outside the house, maybe it was a more affluent household. And it could be that those factors, not the breastfeeding, was what was behind the better child IQ. Or maybe even when the woman went back to work, if she was an executive who worked in an office which had a pumping room and she had a fridge in her office to store breast milk, she could still use breast milk. Whereas if you worked on a factory, then maybe you did not have that access. And again, it's the mother's job that drives the future IQ. So what the researchers then did is they controlled for other factors. What does it mean to control for other factors? You strip out the differences in IQ that are attributed to those other factors and not to breastfeeding. So when you control for the mother's own intelligence, the mother's education, family poverty, the mother's age, and all of those other things, then the difference between breastfed and bottle-fed kids became 0.52. This was a rounding error. This was a tiny amount. It could have been entirely due to luck. And so based on this, we decided not to follow exclusive breastfeeding. Yes, it was still our primary mode, but we would switch to the bottle if my wife wanted a break or if I wanted to help out as the father. So why do I start my talk with this particular story? It's to highlight four things which are the four themes of my talk. The first is that research is everywhere. So I really appreciate you signing on to this webinar, which is about listening to data and research, because many of you, your day jobs will not be to look at research. Unlike me and Richard as professors, you don't spend your whole day looking at academic papers. Some people will go through life without reading a single academic paper. But what I'm highlighting is research is everywhere. Whenever we are deciding to breastfeed or bottle feed our kids, we are acting on the basis of research. Whenever you read a copy of Men's Health, Women's Fitness, or Runner's World, you are acting on the basis of research. Let's say you saw the London Marathon on Sunday, you got inspired. Should you train with high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state? That is research. What happens if you want to better yourself in other ways? You read a self-help book like Outliers or Atomic Habits or The 4-Hour Work Week. You are acting on the basis of research. And research isn't just through reading. You could listen to talks. So the second most viewed TED Talk of all time by Amy Cuddy claims that you can improve your performance in interpersonal situations like job interviews, like public speaking, if you start with a power pose, a victory pose to add energy to your body. That has been completely debunked. And also, research might not be formal studies, it might be just learning from other people, reading a blog article like How Waking Up at 5 a.m. Changed My Life. But all of this is research, so when we get this right or whether we get this wrong, this really matters. We need to take misinformation seriously, irrespective of whether your day job involves data. Your life will almost certainly be affected many, many times by the findings of research. That's point number one. Point number two is the truth is not enough. So many people, when they think about misinformation, they think, well, the solution to misinformation is to check the facts. So the claim that Barack Obama is not a US citizen, that is misinformation, and that can be debunked by producing his birth certificate. But what I'm highlighting here is that just checking the facts is not enough, because even if a fact is 100% accurate, it might still be misleading. So Google was correct. What Google highlighted up here was completely consistent with what we see down there. They correctly conveyed what was said in the study. But this was still misinformation. Why? Because there were many other things that they did not show. And so this is why just checking the facts, just checking whether this was said, is not sufficient. And this also means that we can't rely on regulation to deal with misinformation. We often think that if misinformation is about lying, then we can have a regulator prosecute you for that. But again, given that even if something is true, it can still be misleading, we can't just rely on regulation. Instead, we need to rely on ourselves, our own discernment, and that's what this talk is about. So you might think, well, why aren't we discerning? So for me, as a finance professor who deals with information, why didn't I bother to click on the study to see what the study actually said? And shouldn't I know, as a professor of finance, that correlation is not causation? Yes, I should have known. I should have thought with a clear head, because in the cold light of day, you know that correlation is not causation. But the problem is the third part of my talk, is that we are biased. We don't think with a clear head because of our biases. And one big bias is confirmation bias. So that is the temptation to accept something uncritically because we want it to be true. And so there's studies which show that if you see some evidence that you like, it activates the striatum. That is the part of the brain that releases dopamine. It feels as good as having a great meal, having a laugh with friends, going for a long run. So it just feels good to see something you like, and therefore we don't bother to question it. And this was the case for me. And importantly, when you think about biases, often people think these biases are deep-set ideological biases. Somebody might have a strong position about immigration, about climate change, about gun control, about abortion. But here it was a very subtle bias. It was just the hunch that something natural, like breast milk, is always going to be better than something artificial like formula. That's a small hunch. It's not a big bias, but it was enough to skew me and perhaps thousands of other people to thinking it must be true that breast milk is better than formula. We think something natural is better than something artificial. The fourth and final part to my talk is that we need to check everything. So even reliable sources like the National Childbirth Trust, like the World Health Organization, these sources might not be fully accurate. Now, you might think, well, checking everything, well, that's difficult. Well, because that would mean that we need to check literally everything. And indeed, I myself have read other books on misinformation, which are useful, but they seem to present a long laundry list of all the different ways in which we can be misinformed. And so sometimes for the reader, it's hard for us to remember them and to put it into practice. So what I do is I try to disentangle the types of misinformation into 4 categories. And so this fourth part has 4 subcomponents. There are 4 types of mistakes that we make when interpreting misinformation, and I display this on something I call the ladder of misinference. Here are the 4 missteps we make when we interpret information. The first is we confuse a statement with fact. We are not aware that a statement is not fact because it may not be accurate. So the statement about more breastfed babies have higher IQ, that was a statement, but it was not accurate because it did not give the full picture. Let me give another example, which might be even more damaging and even more important than breastfeeding. It's one of life or death. So this is a highly cited article published in a very prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, which claimed that addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. So if you gave patients opioids to combat pain, they did not get addicted. And this was cited by 1,653 articles, citing this as apparent proof that there is no danger of addiction to opioids. But unfortunately, as we know, there has been a huge opioid epidemic throughout the world. In the US alone, 650,000 people died from opioid overdoses over a span of 20 years. Why? Because people cited this paper, they used this as evidence of non-addiction without actually checking it. So what did this actually say? Let's go to this study. Here's the first page of the study. You might think, well, what about the second and third pages? There are none. This apparently landmark study was just a letter to the editor, a 5-sentence letter to the editor where a reader wrote and said they thought that addiction was rare. And this was cited 1,653 times by people thinking it was a scientific peer-reviewed study when it was just a letter. And here are some of the concerns, right? They looked at people who had got just one narcotic preparation. Maybe one doesn't get you addicted, but 2 or more does. And they also focused on hospitalized patients. Maybe you can't get addicted in hospital because the doses are very controlled. But if people are taking opioids at home, then there's a huge danger of addiction because there's no control. But this was cited without anybody checking what it was just a letter. So the second step is that facts are not data. They may not be representative. So let's say you don't have an issue. You were given a fact which is comprehensive. It gives you the full picture. Well, why a fact may not be data is that it can be a single isolated fact. It is a single cherry-picked example. So take the third most viewed TED Talk of all time. It's called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. It claims that you will become a storming success if you start with why, if you have a purpose, if you have a passion. And he quotes facts to support him. Apple is extremely successful. That is a true fact. One of the most successful companies in the world had a why. Wikipedia, that beat Microsoft-backed Encarta to become the world's fountain for knowledge. And the Wright brothers, they all beat Samuel Pierpont Langley to launch the first test-powered flight. All facts, all supportive of the idea that why leads to success. But this is not data, because these are just cherry-picked examples. There could be hundreds of other companies that did start with why, but they failed. But Simon Sinek is never going to tell you about them because they do not support his story. What you want is data. And this is what data does. So this is what you do in a clinical trial. You have some participants, you give some of them a drug, you see how many of them get better and how many of them get worse. And then you give the others a placebo, see how many of them get better and how many of them get worse, and you compare the two. And importantly, you have people who had the drug and got worse. So that's like companies that start with why and then fail. And similarly, you have companies with the placebo that get better. Those are companies that don't start with why, yet still succeed anyway. But you will never see any of them in any book by Simon Sinek. Why? Because they don't go with his story. So he ignores them. He only shows you the cases in which companies start with why and they succeed. Those are facts. This is not data. Third step is data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. So what is data? Data is just a collection of facts. What is evidence? Well, evidence in a criminal trial is evidence that points to one culprit, but not other culprits. So if evidence suggests that anybody could have committed the crime, it is not evidence. So go back to the breastfeeding example. That study suggests that breastfeeding causes higher child IQ, but it's not evidence because it's consistent with alternative suspects. Maybe there's common causes like family background that both explain the decision to breastfeed and also contribute to IQ. So you might think, well, how do we identify these alternative suspects? It's difficult. Do we need a PhD in statistics? No, we just need common sense. So when people see a study that they don't like, then there's no shortage of comments on LinkedIn on why correlation is not causation. All I'm asking is us to apply the same discernment when there's a study we do like. And to exercise that discernment, what I suggest doing is imagine the study found the opposite result, the result that you don't want. How would you knock it down? Well, you would say there's alternative suspects. If breastfeeding led to lower child IQ, which we don't agree with, we might think, well, maybe it's family background. Maybe poorer families are breastfeeding, they can't afford formula. And so, once we've alerted to ourselves to this rival theory, this alternative suspect of family background, then maybe ask ourselves, does it still apply, even if the result is the one that we do? The fourth and final step is that evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So let's say in a criminal trial, you found that the husband killed the wife. That's true in that situation, but that does not mean every single time a woman dies, it's the husband who did it. Evidence is true in where it was originally gathered, but a proof is something that applies everywhere. And so many of you will know Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hours rule. He claims that if you put 10,000 hours into something, anything, you will be successful. Is it playing chess or being a neurosurgeon? It doesn't matter. Yet the study he based his article on, his book on, was just on violins. Violin is very different to all of these other settings. Something that you find in violins does not apply elsewhere. So let me sum everything up. So the first misstep is that a statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. How do we challenge this? Just check the source, what was actually said, read the full thing, And did they only look at hospitalized patients? Did they only look at one dose of opioids? The second is facts are not data. They may not be representative. Check the full picture. Does the author include examples of those with the secret source who failed, or those without the secret source who succeeded? If not, then he is giving you cherry-picked examples. Third, data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. Check for rival theories, alternative suspects, other explanations of the same data. And to do this, imagine it had the opposite result. How would you knock it down? What would be the alternative suspects that you'd bring up? And fourth and finally, evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. Check the context if what we see here is something in violins that needn't imply that it also works for other things like neurosurgery and chess. Finally, you might think, oh, this is difficult. We need to check absolutely everything here. Is this going to lead to our life being neurotic? But my final suggestion is this should allow us to relax. Right? Because if we find that certain studies are not as black and white as they claim, then my wife can bottle feed without the fear that this is going to destroy our child's IQ. It suggests that the black and white messages of many of these theories are not actually as strong as they claim, and the idea is to allow us to live more freely rather than being enslaved to particular studies. Thanks so much for the attention. Let me hand back to Richard for the Q&A.
Oh, thanks, Alex. That was really nice to hear. Yeah, super talk. Wonderful. I can't see you. I've lost you. Have you turned off your camera? Oh, have we really lost Alex?
I think he might have left. I will. We'll get him back on in a moment.
Okay, right. Oh, I had a wonderful set of questions to ask him. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's a good cue for me to say to you, I'm longing for you to type your questions into the chat because it gives me something to say. Otherwise, you have to put up with my questions, which are always worse than the audience questions. Ah, here you are.
Yes, sorry. I think I tried to stop sharing, but I might have pressed the wrong thing and it kicked me out instead.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. It gave me a wonderful opportunity quickly to look at the audience questions. I will do my question quickly, Alex. Right, so we're in a car together and we're speeding at 100 miles an hour towards a brick wall. And I'm wondering whether to press the brake. And I'm thinking, might not be causation between this brake and slowing down. I know it slows down, but there might not be causation. Do you think there are circumstances when you should suspend your search for correlation and causation and just get on with it? That was my question, really. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
There might be
yes,
situations when you just have to.
Yeah, so you might think, well, why is it that we apply simple rules of thumb? And this, I think, is in our ancestry. For example, when we were hunter-gatherers, situations were life and death situations. So you had pretty black and white rules, such as run from carnivores. And so that was good in most situations. Sometimes it was bad. Why? Because you might run from a dog, and it might be useful for you to domesticate the dog and use the dog for a hunt. So you're right that in our ancestry, we have those life or death situations. Nowadays, we don't have as many of those situations. We don't have animals attacking us. So the other problem we have is we have lots of decisions to make. We need to make decisions at scale. And sometimes simple rules help us deal with complexity. But I think what we should do is recognize the rule is normally good for us, but sometimes there might be cases in which it's incorrect. And so just having a more discernment here will realize when to use rules, but also when to depart from the rule.
Great. Neat answer. Right then, I'm going to hammer through some of these questions. We've got a lot. Right. Peter Green asks, do you believe there's a risk of bias in research based on who is sponsoring it? And the second question he asks, we'll allow him a second question, shall we, which is, are we biased by hot topics such as ESG or climate change?
Yes, absolutely. So number one, there can definitely be a bias in terms of funding, and this is why it's good practice. It's actually more than good practice. Many scientific journals require you to state your funding sources, and if you have failed to do so, even if a paper was accepted, it might subsequently be retracted because you failed to state your funding source, because that might compromise your integrity. Number two, you're also correct that there is a risk of bias for these hot topics. And in particular, often on these hot topics, there is a prevailing narrative. And so there's an incentive to release research that supports that narrative. So it's good that you brought up ESG. I am a big ESG advocate, yet I recognize that a lot of ESG papers are quite flimsy, but they deliver the message that ESG is great because that's what people want to hear. So when there's a hot topic and there is a prevailing view or common wisdom, we need to be particularly careful because some studies may say what people want to hear.
Alex, I'm going to put together, it's a great answer, yeah. I'm going to put together 3 questions because they've got a sort of sense of despair about them, these questions, and it might go together. So Ed Asheg, I do apologise. Matthew Leach says, how much more difficult is it when someone is presenting the information to us and trying hard, in capital letters, to convince us, even though they know the evidence is dodgy or even just lies? And at least what someone else Charles Henderson, in a world that seeks binary answers to everything, isn't using our biases an efficient way to sort the data? And there's another one here on fake news, but let's just take those 2 together. What do you think? So the first one was about someone really, being deceptive they're going up your ladder deceptively, using your ladder as a weapon.
I would probably then just disregard him or her. So if they are being completely stringent and not recognizing the limitations of their data, I would be concerned. And so often when people post something on social media saying there's unquestioning proof, there's infallible facts, the more you embellish your claims to correctness, then the more likely it is that there's actually no foundations behind the house. I don't agree with everything that Margaret Thatcher said, but she said if you have to tell somebody you're a lady, you probably are not. So people who try to be as stringent and strident as possible with their claims, it's often because this masks the actual lack of substance behind it. The second question is, can black and white views be useful? And you're absolutely right. So these are useful shortcuts, and this is why evolution has led us to viewing the world in black and white terms. And I would still use shortcuts where possible, but also recognize the mistakes from viewing the world in black and white terms. So let's go to ESG because somebody mentioned it. As an ESG investor, you want to buy sustainable companies. Now, there might be thousands of companies in your universe, and it's impossible to assess every single one. So maybe as a sustainable investor, some of you will use some simple rules, such as never invest in fossil fuel stocks. Now that sometimes can be overly simplistic because some fossil fuel companies are investing urgently in clean energy because they recognize that this is so important given the move towards a net zero economy. But this black and white rule avoiding all fossil fuel stocks, that's something where sometimes it can lead to the wrong decisions. So again, I think, yes, we should certainly use these rules, but recognize sometimes that the rules might not be always lead to the correct decisions. And so even if this is going to lead to us putting less weight on fossil fuel stocks, maybe blanket exclusion is too much and we should refrain from that.
Yeah, what's that quote? All models are wrong, but some are useful. I can't remember who said it, but now V Kong asks, ChatGPT, which has the power to trawl a great amount of data, will it also be misled by misinformation? Is his question.
I think it can, and if you've got different perspectives, Richard, you're much more of an expert on this than me. So people think, is ChatGPT going to be a huge solution to misinformation because can't this separate the wheat from the chaff? But I believe that ChatGPT and other types of generative AI, they can only go on what's out there and in the public domain. And so if something like the 10,000 hours rule from Malcolm Gladwell has been widely shared and is all over the internet, then it may well be that ChatGPT thinks this is correct, because you can see so much of a support for that type of rule. So I think AI can be helpful sometimes as a tool to detect misinformation, but because it goes about what's widely shared about on the internet, it can still be fooled.
Yeah, it's more susceptible, I would say, because it doesn't have the tools you're talking about. Anyway, what do I know? Matt Gledhill asks, this is a good one. In highly divisive topic areas such as carbon markets, research is often instigated by proponents or opponents rather than neutral researchers. Is this common in many subjects? And if so, in these subjects, can we use research at all to make good judgments?
Great question. I think it is common, but it's what I would not actually call research. I call this advocacy. So there are many organizations now which are claiming to do research, but you know what they will find. So in my field of ESG, the High Pay Center does research on CEO pay. Every study will claim that CEOs are too highly paid because that's what their purpose is. Any study by McKinsey on diversity will claim that diversity pays off. Why? Because that's what is good for its image. It would never claim that diversity worsens firm performance. So this is why what I think counts as proper research is research published in top peer-reviewed scientific journals done by scientists, because there is not a particular viewpoint that they need to try to show. And most research might not be funded. In fact, I have never taken any funding from any company or investor to do my research. And if you do have funding from a potentially conflicted source, you do have to disclose it. Now, this doesn't mean that every single academic paper is correct. There have unfortunately been cases, like Francesca Gino at Harvard, of academics with fraudulent papers. But what I believe is that academic scientific papers are more likely to be free of these biases than advocacy papers, even though they're not completely blameless.
Yeah, I mean, just to shout out for your blog, Alex, which I read quite avidly. I mean, it's a good read, ladies and gentlemen. It's full of interesting takedowns of what look to be very impressive papers by people with letters after their names. So now, Richard Priest asks, and this is a question I think sort of business background. How do you overcome bias when considering potential future scenarios for events that haven't happened but may happen in the future? So a lot of our audience will be, strategists or thinking about things that might happen. Have you got any advice, Alex?
Yeah, so I think cognitive diversity is really helpful. So often people think about diversity as in having a mix of genders and races, but I think it's quite different to cognitive diversity, which is to try to have a range of viewpoints and to encourage dissent. So I think the best way to look at future scenarios and how to come up with them and prepare for them is to have a corporate culture that encourages dissent. That could have a multiple set of different practices. One of them is for a new strategy to appoint a devil's advocate to try to poke holes in that new strategy, or a red team where an entire team is tasked with trying to find out potential holes in one of the strategies or plans that a company has come up with. Another thing you can do is you can even automate this. So at DBS, which is a Singaporean bank, they have something called a raccoon. WRECKOON. So this is a raccoon themed mascot where at various points in a PowerPoint presentation, it will come up and say, what could go wrong? What assumptions are we making and not stating? What have we missed out? And so this is indeed something which continues to ask questions. And that link to that is something more subtle. You might think, well, that's a bit drastic, but smaller things that can encourage dissent are the following. So let's say you're in a meeting, and then somebody raises an objection, and despite the objection, people still go ahead. Sometimes the chair will go to the dissenter afterwards and say, I really appreciate you speaking up. Even though we still went ahead with the decision, I want you to recognize that we really valued you expressing those concerns. And even though we will do the strategy, we will do it bearing in mind those concerns. If you hadn't done that, then the person might think, I went through all the pain of raising concerns and they went ahead with the decision anyway. I was just slowing down the meeting and wasting people's time. But this highlights, no, you truly value people who express different opinions.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a seminar to be written about that, isn't it? How to validate. I don't mean validate. I mean pat on the back people who ask troublesome questions. Yeah, Shane Drinian asks an interesting question, actually. What can people do when the research stroke available information is complex and potentially beyond the individual's comprehension? Are there easy ways for people to bridge this knowledge gap practically?
Yeah, very good question. So there's a couple of things. So number one, even in the most technical papers, they will start off with an abstract, which is a 150 or 100-word layman summary of the evidence of the main findings. And so if that's written well, that should be accessible to a general audience. But the second thing you can do is to read a systematic review. So what this is a review of lots of papers, and so this helps because it makes sure that you're not skewed by one particular paper. You look at the body of scientific evidence and it summarizes each study into something pretty simple. Think of it like just a much more erudite Wikipedia article, so it gives the overall consensus of the topic. So in medicine, you have the Cochrane reviews for medicine, and that looks at, say, the effect of vaccination. Does it cause autism and something like that? You could even look at other things like the BBC website or the National Health Service website that will give the scientific consensus on the effectiveness of a drug, the side effects of a drug. In my field, which is finance, you'll have things like the annual review of financial economics, where the clue is in its name. The fact that it's a review means that it reviews lots of studies and presents the overall picture, so you see the forest and you don't get bogged down in the individual trees.
And Sam Dibb says, you make a strong case for the benefits of skepticism. Why do you think this is now often used as a negative term?
I think it's because nowadays we confuse two things. We confuse the destination with the approach. So if somebody raises concerns with a particular approach to net zero, then people think that is a concern. That's because you just don't believe in net zero to begin with. You're a climate change denier. But it could be that you believe in net zero, but you're skeptical of as to whether just selling all fossil fuel stocks is the best way for an investor to achieve this. Maybe an investor should buy fossil fuel companies and engage with them and force them to cut their emissions. But often, when we see some dissent, some skepticism, people think they're against us, they want to go after a different goal, where they might actually want to achieve the same goal but have a different approach to doing so. And so what I hope to do with this talk and the book behind it is to encourage healthy debate, respect for different opinions, recognize that there's a different series of ways to try to achieve a particular shared outcome.
Interesting. Right, we are almost out of time, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, and I can see Alex has done a fantastic job of getting through the questions that I managed to read, but I didn't do such a fantastic job of reading them all because there were too many to read. So if you had a great question and I didn't answer it, I can only humbly apologise. Just a brief look at what's coming up in the near future. The Gresham Society hosts these lectures. Gresham Society is the supporters club for Gresham College, where both Alex and I taught. If you like this sort of thing, then I recommend tuning into Gresham College. They have a slightly longer form version of these lectures, and they look great lectures, don't they? So do sign up for those if you are interested in any of those things. Thank yous. Firstly, thank you for the audience. Fantastic to have so many people online and you're so engaged. Thank you for your kind remarks, which I've seen in the commentary, which we will pass on to Alex. People saying it's the best lecture they've seen this season, so that's really nice to see. Most of all, thank you to Alex. Wonderful to see you again. Wonderful to see your child, who are looking particularly handsome and bonny. So that was great. This lecture and all our lectures are recorded and posted on the YouTube channel. So if you'd like to revisit it or rave about it or Twitter or do whatever else you do, then please do so. Other than that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
And thank you from me. Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the audience.